Aethelred I became King of Wessex in 865. His father was Aethelwulf, who had ruled reasonably well until he decided to take a trip to Rome to see the Pope. On his way back to England, Aethelwulf had stopped off at the court of the Frankish king, Charles the Bald, and married Charles's daughter, Judith of Flanders. When Athelwulf returned to England alongside Judith, he found the situation in Wessex had dramatically changed. His son Athelbald had gone into open rebellion against him. One historian feels that Athelbald's actions were entirely justified, firstly because of the timing of Athelwulf's trip overseas. He had chosen to go to Rome when the Viking incursions in England were clearly becoming more dangerous. Athelbald viewed his father's actions as being irresponsible. The same historian also believes that Athelbald viewed his father's second marriage to Judith as a potential threat to his status as heir, prompting his revolt. However, I don't agree with that second assertion. Even if Athelwulf produced children with Judith, which he didn't, it'd be a long time before they would be considered a suitable candidate for the throne. Child rulers in the age of the Viking invasions were not a good idea. Whatever the motives for Athelbald's rebellion were, the decision was taken to split Wessex between father and son, rather than allow a civil war to break out. Disunity was not what the kingdom needed. Athelwulf died in 858, and Athelbald would rule the whole of Wessex for the next 2 years, which the chronicler Asa, author of the Life of Alfred the Great, describes as a period of lawlessness. Asa's hostility to Athelbald's reign was mainly driven by Athelbald's shocking decision to marry Judith, who had been his stepmother. There is no real indication that Athelbald's reign was particularly lawless, as Asa had described, but he probably did gain some notoriety for his behaviour. Athelbald died in 860 and was succeeded by his brother Athelbert, whose succession added to the Wessex crown the kingdom of Kent as well as Essex and Surrey. As was the case for many kings in this time, knowledge of Athelbert's reign is somewhat limited, but judging by comments made in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and by Asa, the latter of whom remarked that Athelbert had governed his kingdom for 5 years in peace, love, and honour, it seems that Athelbert was a king that was well thought of. For England as a whole, the country continued to live under the menace of Viking raids. During Athelbert's reign, the Vikings launched a devastating raid on Winchester and putting it to flames. However, the Anglo-Saxons were a determined people, and the men of Hampshire and Berkshire returned the compliment by routing the invaders in battle. However, the Viking threat continued, and in Kent, despite promises of peace in return for payment, the raiders continued to wreak havoc across the east of Kent. So Asa's words that Athelbert had reigned for 5 years in peace are probably over-optimistic, but all the same, we're starting to see signs during Athelbert's reign of England becoming more unified, not just geographically, but militarily as well. Athelbert was succeeded in 865 by his brother Aethelred I, who's not to be confused with the later king Aethelred the Unready. Aethelred was a young man when he became king of Wessex, aged about 20. He had inherited a tough situation, with the Viking wars becoming more intense with each passing year. Aethelred had also seen several older brothers die young and in quick succession. However, he did have one remaining brother who would be a key supporter. This younger brother was named Alfred, and he would join Aethelred in a number of battles against the Vikings. In 868, Aethelred was asked for assistance from Buchred, king of Mercia, who was married to Aethelred's and Alfred's one sister, Aethelswith. Aethelred heeded the call and gathered an army, marching into the kingdom of Mercia, all the way to Nottingham, where they besieged a Viking fortification. The invaders, however, were not daft. It wasn't all about sacking and raiding. If they found themselves in a tight corner, and making a peace agreement was the prudent path to take, then that's exactly what they would do. After all, a truce could be broken later on. As for the Saxon army, it seems as though the siege was not making much headway, and a truce may have been the sensible option for them also. The Vikings retreated back to York, and Aethelred and his men presumably went back to Wessex. However, it would not be long before the raiders were at it again. In 870, the Vikings carried out a particularly shocking execution. This was of the King of East Anglia, Edmund the Martyr. On being informed that the Vikings were once again sailing from York to East Anglia, Edmund was urged to flee for his life. However, he defiantly refused to abandon his people, saying he'd rather die a violent death than safe in his bed years later, knowing he'd abandoned his people in their hour of need. Brave to the last, Edmund was captured by the Vikings, tied to a tree, and shot full of arrows before his head was hacked off. For kings like Aethelred, when he got word of what had happened to Edmund, it would have been the most harrowing of news. He would have been fully aware that this was the reality of kingship in England during the Viking Wars, and there was no place for cowardice. And Aethelred demonstrated time and again that he was certainly no coward, even if his successes were limited. In the first week of January 871, Aethelred, joined by Alfred, marched into Berkshire and attacked a Viking fort at Reading. They cut down every Dane they could find outside the walls of the fortress, but those inside soon poured out like wolves and waged battle on the Saxon army. It was a ferocious battle, but eventually the Vikings, led by Halfdan, forced Aethelred and his men to turn their backs and flee from the battle. But this retreat was no sign of Aethelred's forces losing their stomach for the fight. Just 4 days later, Aethelred galvanized his men and launched another campaign against the Vikings, and this time routed them at Ashdown. According to Acer, the Vikings had the advantage in this particular battle, as they had gained the higher ground, with the Anglo-Saxons having to storm uphill to engage the enemy. Whether it was through sheer force of will, or perhaps some tactic that Aethelred had employed during the battle, his army eventually got the upper hand and inflicted great damage on the Vikings. Obviously, after the defeat at Reading, for Aethelred this would have been both a tremendous morale boost and somewhat a saving of face. As king, he needed to show his subjects that he could defend them from Viking raids, and he had demonstrated that he was perfectly willing to take the attack to the invaders. But Aethelred's successes were short-lived. Not long after, he and Alfred were defeated at the Battle of Basing in Hampshire. Just weeks later, Aethelred was dead, no older than 26. Acer says that Aethelred had governed his kingdom bravely, honourably, and with good repute through many tribulations. These words are quite fitting for a king who has now been long forgotten. But Aethelred did leave a positive legacy despite the setbacks he had suffered. Although Aethelred had two young sons at the time of his death, neither of these little boys were suitable to become king. They were no more than infants, and it was obvious to everybody that they could not take the crown. But Aethelred had prepared a ready-made successor as an alternative. Joining him in his campaigns had been his younger brother Alfred, who now became king on Aethelred's death. Alfred was battle-hardened and had first-hand experience in the Viking Wars. If anybody was ready for kingship in Wessex at that time, or for that matter anywhere else in England, it was Alfred. It was these early experiences that formed Alfred the Great.